Now to slide 7. I want to take a brief period of time to speak about the international influence of Sukarno's Indonesia, and then next week or the week after, we will be speaking about the man and his country. Yeah, week 9, the week after next. So Sukarno, without trying to get into his actual history, had been a long-time activist before independence, spent some time in prison, did a lot of underground organizing, and was the predominant leader of the opposition to colonialism, and managed to become the leader of Indonesia after independence. He was an interesting figure, a very clear thinker, certainly, and a very bold man with a personality. He could keep any crowd entranced. Although he was short in stature, whenever he walked into a room, everybody knew it. He became a major sponsor of the non-aligned movement, which was a reaction in part to the threat of nuclear destruction. The non-aligned movement aimed to avoid neo-colonialization, as they put it. Neo-colonialization meant not formal colonies like the British, the Dutch, the French had, but colonies based on economic dominance. They accused the United States and the Soviet Union, economic and military dominance, of pursuing this type of colonialism, and their criticisms were not too far off the mark, to be blunt, and their appeal was very wide. It was at the Bandung Conference in 1955, sponsored, that's in Indonesia, sponsored by Sukarno, where the movement really began to take off. It was not called that until the year afterwards. And take off it did. It led to complications for both the Soviets and the Americans in trying to pursue their struggle with each other for domination. Sukarno himself became a target of the Americans, who knew that he was vulnerable because the Americans had built up extensive contacts in the Indonesian military. And the military itself, of course, was the ultimate power broker in that society. We'll talk more about that in 2 weeks. Sukarno also initiated, when he began to really turn left in the late 50s and into the early 60s, he initiated a policy toward the British and Malaya in the last years of Britain's colonial presence there in Malaya. He initiated a policy he called konfrontasi, or confrontation. This policy was intended to make the British stop trying to to give up their presence in what is now East Malaysia, on the island of Borneo. East Malaysia makes up, I don't know, maybe 25% of Borneo, and the rest of it belongs to Indonesia. Borneo is a huge place. But Sukarno did not want, and it's also a place that has oil. Brunei is up in that neighborhood as well. Brunei is is a very small place, but it's very oil rich. And this may have been on Sukarno's mind. I'm sure that he wasn't confined entirely to high-minded thinking when it came to these things. Anyway, the konfrontasi policy failed on two levels. One is that the British and the forces that they had built up to take over after they left in Malaya were able to overcome the efforts of the Indonesians to land troops, initiate guerrilla activities in West Malaysia, the peninsular Malaysia, the part that's connected to Thailand, and to do the same thing over in East Malaysia. And so, in short, the Indonesians had to give that up. Now, the failure there caused a move even further to the left. Sukarno decided to take the side of China in the Sino-Soviet dispute. His aid began to come mostly from China in about 1963-64, and he moved toward an alliance with the PKI, as you'll see if you watch the movie The Year of Living Dangerously, the PKI standing for Parti Komunis Indonesia. This failed. Part of the reason it failed was that, again, to be blunt, I'm being a little bit rough here, but the Americans decided they didn't want that to happen, and so it didn't happen. There are two reasons why that decision was so decisive. One is that the Americans held the balance of strategic power in the region, and everybody knew that. Therefore, if one is thinking in practical terms, it would be stupid to oppose the Americans if they decide they want to get rid of Sukarno. The second reason, as I mentioned a little while ago, was that the Americans had good relations inside the Indonesian military. But there was a third thing, and that was that Sukarno apparently was moving toward a coup d'etat. Of course, he was in charge. How can you have a coup d'etat against yourself? But his coup d'etat wasn't going to be against himself. It was going to be by the PKI and their allies against the army. That didn't work. The army heard about this somehow and moved against Sukarno and the PKI before it could happen. And that, of course, is the key event in that movie, that The Year of Living Dangerously, that you can stream online through D2L. His downfall was an extremely important incident during the Cold War because it meant, when it was over with, that China had failed to secure a key ally in Southeast Asia. It meant that the Americans still reigned supreme in that part of the world, and that the Chinese would have to go back to the drawing board. Let's go on to the next slide. It says Bandung Conference. I got a little bit ahead of myself here. I think I've really said everything here except the two interesting points. One is, and the Bandung Conference, of course, oh, I made a mistake on this slide. I'll correct it, though. That's Zhou Enlai, Sukarno, and Nasser in Bandung in 1955, not 1965. So the two interesting points here are that people all over Southeast Asia were unhappy about Chinese government policy concerning the Chinese diaspora, that is, concerning people who had emigrated from China to Southeast Asian countries. Chinese policy, unstated but very clear, was that anyone who left China was still a Chinese citizen in the eyes of the Chinese government. That gets a little bit fuzzy. Of course, you'd think, oh, what about a third-generation Chinese American? Is that a Chinese citizen too? That wasn't really the issue, though. The issue was people who were 1 or 2 generations removed, who were speakers and writers and readers of the Chinese language, and who had formed communities that remained essentially apart from native communities in Southeast Asian countries. Now, in some Southeast Asian countries, it was different than in others. For example, in Thailand, Chinese people don't have names that are clearly distinguishable. There's some difference, but they're not clearly distinguishable from Thai people. There is an ethnic divide in Thailand. In Indonesia, before 1965, Chinese people retained their Chinese names. After 1965, when the military took over, it became illegal to have a Chinese name, and everyone had to pull a switch and adopt an Indonesian name. You can still tell if you learn a little bit of Indonesian, then you can eventually detect which names were originally Chinese and have been switched to Indonesian. It isn't like the names themselves have changed, it's just that the spelling and the pronunciation changed. But there were variable, and in the Philippines is another example. In the Philippines, Chinese integrated much more thoroughly into the local population and adopted completely Filipino names. And they nowadays are completely Filipino people, even though they might avoid too much intermarriage. So in some countries, though, like Indonesia, in Vietnam, in Laos and Cambodia, and in Malaysia, Chinese people remained very much apart from the local population. They had their own schools. They continued to teach their children the Chinese language. So this was a sore spot because of all the love that exists between the different ethnic groups in Asia. I'm sorry, did I say love? Because of all the suspicion and the bitterness over all sorts of things that we don't have time to get into in this course, like pogroms and murders and so on, that have gone on for many generations between ethnic groups that are highly suspicious of each other. So at the Bandung Conference, the Chinese decided to issue an official statement saying that Chinese people living in places like Indonesia were not Chinese citizens. They were the citizens of their own countries. That was a big deal. It caused suspicion against China in the region to drop, and combined with other activities, or rather other events, it led to a brief honeymoon period between China and the countries of the Southeast Asia. The other interesting incident that contributed to that was the attempted assassination of Zhou Enlai while he was on a flight that he was scheduled to take but did not board from Hong Kong to Bandung. The aircraft, which was called the Kashmir Princess, operated by India with an Indian crew, had gone to pick up Zhou Enlai in Hong Kong. While it was there, a bomb was planted aboard. It happened to have an American timing device. Very sloppy, if you ask me. And it was planted by a man who later took refuge in Taiwan. And for humanitarian reasons, the Taiwan government decided not to extradite him for questioning to Hong Kong by the British. The British were not happy about this because they have to live in China. They have, at the time, they had an embassy in Peking, and they had to maintain that big crown colony on the South China coast, abutting communist China itself. So they didn't like doing things that would piss off the Chinese. They liked getting along for very practical reasons, and they did not like the Kuomintang operating a secret assassination cell in the Crown Colony. But that's what was going on. A secret assassination cell that almost killed the Premier of China. Nasty business, but we don't have any problems like that nowadays, do we? Unless you go to the movie theaters. Going on to slide 9, the long but successful road, it says here, of Vietnamese nationalism. Vietnamese nationalism was highly successful, and it was highly successful for a number of distinct reasons. They followed many of the same paths intellectually and practically that as did the Chinese nationalists and communists, who were also successful in their own country at moving people away from traditional solutions, both social and governmental. This is in the readings. It's described very well. The discrediting of Confucian institutions and the early acceptance of social Darwinism. They had their own Nelson Mandela, a man named Phan Boi Chau. Phan Boi Chau was an intellectual who had ideas very similar to the Chinese nationalists and who was inspired by Sun Yat-sen. And for his trouble, he was put into prison by the French in 1925. He lived for another 15 years, but he never got out of prison. His absence on the scene was convenient for the Indo-Chinese Communist Party, founded in 1930, or I guess I should say it was convenient for the Communist International, because the Communist International, run out of Moscow, which we discussed before, was the principal sponsor of the Indo-Chinese Communist Party. However, this did not mean that Ho Chi Minh was anybody's puppet. Far from it. Ho Chi Minh was an independent thinker and a very practical man who used the funds made available to him and the training made available to him to build a solid organization. It took decades for him to do it, but in the context of the times, the nationalist organization that he built gained an appeal that made it unstoppable. Let's go on to slide 10. The Russian and Chinese support for Ho Chi Minh was substantial. Ho Chi Minh himself stayed outside of Vietnam from 1927 to 1941, which in itself was a very important form of support. And the training in organization, propaganda, military work, and clandestine methods, including intelligence, was also substantial. Those, by the way, are the core businesses of any communist party. That is, propaganda, organization, military work, and intelligence work. The relationship between Ho Chi Minh and the Chinese Communist Party was very, very close. This photograph you see at the top here, this is taken on Mao's birthday in 1950. He's visiting, or 1949, I beg your pardon. 50. No, 49, thank you. In 1949. He's visiting Russia in 1949. It's December 26th, Mao's birthday. You can see he's having a really good time. Smiles all around. Contrast that with Ho Chi Minh's reception from Zhou Enlai and the bromance going on at the bottom of the page there between Ho Chi Minh and Mao Zedong. This is very real. Ho Chi Minh spoke fluent Chinese, and he had spent many years working in Canton with the Chinese Communists in their early stage. So there was a close relationship, there was a lot of trust, and It was trust that overcame, even after Vietnam became an independent country, the long-standing rivalry between China and Vietnam. Overcoming that rivalry lasted for a few more years after Ho died in 1969, but in historical terms, not long. Let's stop here. We'll go on to slide 11. Slide 12, rather.